Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. Hi, this is Eddie K. Phillips. I am the Erudition Network founder, and I'd like to welcome you this week to another broadcast of the Erudition Network Interactive Black History and Knowledge session. Um, this week, we're going to hit on some couple of things, questions that were brought up last week. But before we get to all of that, I wanted to hit on a couple of topics. This program is an hour. Again, my name is Eddie Phillips. The Erudition Network is dedicated to providing Black history and knowledge and giving you an opportunity to ask questions live when we're on every Thursday evening. Erudition is not per se a talk show, and that I'm not on here to just generally entertain you. I am here to provide some knowledge and some understanding on things that are not often covered in history or have been hidden to us, both all cultures in American and world history. We have been on for several months now, and we're attempting now to get a little bit more serious about this whole thing of uh, history, Black history, and knowledge. You know, this particular program is done every week on Thursday, and we do it with a labor of love because the idea is to provide you with information and knowledge that you can then share with others and at the same time share the broadcast so that others can join us on Thursday and engage in conversation. All right, Ambassador Henry, thank you. Thank you for joining us. It is so important for us, ladies and gentlemen, to understand our history, to get our minds around the idea that a lot of things in our history have been hidden to us. Um, Often when I talk to people, they're surprised by what they don't really know or what has not been taught really well to them in 12 years, some post elementary and high school education, and so that does not surprise me. However, one of the things that we want to do is we want to fill that gap, right? We want to remove those deltas for people. I've been telling people for months, get your kids, your teenagers, your young people to participate in Erudition. Get on here and ask questions. Every now and again, we have a session where we get people who come in and they throw questions. As a matter of fact, and I don't want to belabor this as we get into this week's lesson. Um, One of the people who we got from YouTube last week threw out a lot of names, that I thought in retrospect, I said, I guarantee you most people do not know some of the names that this young lady is throwing out here. And arguably, I saw one of my friends who was on from the Navy said that, it was Googled, you're throwing Google names on there. Though that may be true, the fact is that those names were put out there. There were questions asked about people who we don't generally talk about presidents that we don't generally talk about. In today's day and age, where we're dealing with laws and things that are in our culture that show the double standard in America, it is so important to know this history. Some of the names that she put out were Margaret Sanger, right? Who was a key component for birth control. I think Sally Hemings was mentioned, who was the mother of the kids that Thomas Jefferson had with her, and Sally Hemings was a slave. I think Warren G. Harding was mentioned as the president of the United States, who some argue was a good president, and some argue was a bad president. Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, the Dyer Act. All of these things were mentioned last week. And though those things are great to mention, what was also said was a misrepresentation of history, right? Because some people have have these thoughts on history based on what they're taught in school, right? And that's nothing wrong with that. You go to school to learn and you assume that what they're teaching you is absolutely correct. At least that's what you're taught in those years in which you attend school. But the reality of it is, quite honestly, is that a lot of the history that you are taught is taught for a purpose. It is taught to keep you in a line, to not ask some questions, and to accept some facts. So I wanted to touch this week on this session. I wanted to make this a very, very distinct knowledge session. I encourage you to ask questions, but I want to go over a couple of things. And I'm going to give you some more names. And I'm going to type those names in as we go along because I want you to remember these names. And one of the first things we're going to talk about is James Weldon Johnson. Now, if you don't know who James Weldon Johnson is, please chime up and let me know. But James Weldon Johnson, among many things, was a poet, was a writer, was an educator, was a leader in the NAACP. Johnson wrote the National Black Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which many of you may have seen in the current football at the beginning of the year. And a lot of people got mad. Why are we playing this? But Johnson had the faith and the idea, just as some people at the turn of the 1900s, that America post-Civil War, right, had made laws and it should be held accountable with those laws. Him and others, W.B. Du Bois and others, Walter White, who later came along after Johnson, all worked at the beginning of the 1900s in what was called at the time the Roaring Twenties, coming out of the 1910s. And if you remember in other lessons that we've done on Erudition, we talked about how so many things were going on around that time, specifically lynching, the murder of systemic murder of Blacks throughout the country. And one of the things that is often lost is how hard James Weldon Johnson pushed the government, the president. Now, I'm bringing this up because a young lady last week said that Harding was a great president. She wanted everybody to believe this because this is what she had been taught, and that Harding was assassinated because he was a good president. And in reality of it, there is a huge unknown history here between Harding and James Weldon Johnson. And so we're going to go into that today. And I really wanted to touch on that. And I want to keep on point with this. And in 1920, Johnson made a trip to see Harding, who was becoming the preemptive. He was going to be the next president of the United States. And because this was the 1920s, after World War I, right, America wanted to return to an idea of normalcy. They didn't want to be in war. They didn't want to go through all of the issues that had plagued them during World War I. And the whole campaign, Harding's campaign at the time was, let's push normalcy, right? Get America back to being what it was, right? Well, that was all well and fine. But you got to remember also, as we showed you several weeks ago, that there were a lot of lynchings. When Black servicemen came back from the First World War, they were killed. There were riots all throughout the country, in Washington, D.C., in the South. There were massacres that were done in the 1910s. And so the NAACP, Johnson had a goal, right? He wanted to push the idea that the president, because Harding had said that he would help, he would be a help. And so Johnson had gotten a meeting, and this was one of the first times that the NAACP was allowed, right, to be able to meet what was going to be a new president. And James Weldon Johnson wanted Harding to endorse the Dyer Act. Now, if you don't know what the Dyer Act was, the Dyer Act was an anti-lynching bill. It was first introduced in Congress and made in the early 1919. And this was done because the Missouri Republican who did it, Leonidas Dyer, pushed this in the House. Now, I like to say that Dyer did this because he thought that he hated the idea of blacks being lynched. But what he really did this for was because coming this time was also, as all of these riots and killings were done, there were migrations going on in the country. People were going from the Deep South to Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Boston. You had people leaving the South to get away from racial animus and crime and lynchings and murders. Many of our African Americans who are in Chicago, who are in these cities, your ancestors, your relatives came there to escape the mistreatment that was going on in the South, that the Dyer bill was trying to get a law passed. Dyer's bill was done because Representative Dyer now had a huge amount of black constituents who had moved from the South and they came to the North where they could vote. That's key. And because the Republicans at the time were seen as the black and tan party, they were seen as people who would allow blacks to vote. Dyer understood, because he was one of them, the power block that blacks had to get people in office. And he had to protect his constituents, especially as all of these racial riots and lynching riots that happened and things like Red Summer started to happen. Well, he wanted to pass this bill. Now, some would say by example right now, this bill was not that intrusive, but it was something to be done around that time. And what it made lynching a federal crime and made it punishable by 5 years of imprisonment. And it was a $5,000 fine that would be levied on those who participated in the lynching. Now, Dyer introduced this bill, as I said, around 1919, and it was basically sat on. No one tried to interact the bill. So when James Weldon Johnson went to go meet with Harding, his hope was to get this president to side and to talk, who was Republican, to side with this bill. He was hopeful that he could get this man who had said that he would support the Dyer bill if the Republican National Committee would support it with him. So there was hope here. And the reason why that happened, and this is the reason why I bring up James Weldon Johnson, why we touch on this, he didn't just write a song. James Weldon Johnson went to Chicago and he met with the heads of the RNC. And to get the backing of their candidate, right? To get Harding to even make that statement, to show the power of black votes. Today, we need to understand the power of people of color's votes. And when Johnson went there, he showed them we can put people in Congress and places of power. We can get presidents elected if you would help us so that we don't have to fear for our lives every day. So when a young lady last week brought up Harding, it was an important thing that made me think we need to talk about this. We need to understand this. So he went there to call on these people to make lynching a issue, to consider to be one of the most effective ways to end it would be by making it a federal law. Now, the big upsurge in voting helped that. Well, Harding, when Johnson met with him, he agreed. Johnson came, he met with him, and he said, as you're going to be president, would you support the Dyer bill? Harding told him very friendly, yes, I will do that. And Johnson wrote that, he was happy all of maybe 1 second because there was another contingency to that. Johnson asked Harding to issue a public statement denouncing the second rising of the Klan. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, right, about a month or two ago, we talked about the Klans. This was the second Klan that rose up under William Simmons, right? And so they had been a huge body. The Klan was hugely popular in the 1920s. They marched on Washington in full Klan regalia. And so when Johnson asked Harding to speak against the Klan, Harding said, "Oh, the hell no. I can't make that statement." Because even though he understood that there was black voting there, the mentality of racist, bigoted mindset still says that their votes count more than your votes. I'm not going to be known as and I hate to say, the nigger president. I cannot do that. But I will sign a bill or push for a bill that will allow your people to not be killed or lynched. So needless to say, Johnson was very angry. And this goes to not support what the young lady said last week, that Harding was all in with blacks. That was not the case. In fact, the NAACP had to push even harder. But what it taught these black men who were the sons and daughters of slaves was how to lobby, how to work in the political system. So pressure was put even further on the party through the black and tan part of the party. And that is important to know. The blacks and the whites who were a voting bloc. So pressure was put so much that Harding, when he made his first address to Congress, inaugural address, he told Congress, wipe the stain of barbaric lynching from the banners of free and orderly representative democracy. Sounds powerful, right? Sounds like it was something that he's with us. And this is why people are deceived. Harding got up there and made a verbal proclamation that we should stop lynching. He never said treat blacks equally, though. He just spoke of lynching. And that was under force. Now, despite the fact that the Republicans, there were 299 Republicans from my notes, representatives, and 59 senators in Washington, that gave the Republican Party a majority in Congress. And many of those people came from those cities and those states that I just spoke of. But wait a minute. Let's understand something. Even though those people were elected with black support and represented districts of substantial black populations, and even though Dyer himself benefited from that, between 1910 and 1920, there was a 33% increase in areas where blacks were. But there was also a huge amount of lynching that was still being perpetuated in the country. In fact, before Harding died, about 57 blacks that we know that are documented were killed and were lynched. Now, the push to get Harding, as we just said, who you may think, oh, this is 100 years ago. How is this important? It was hard, and it was worthwhile. And Johnson spent a huge amount of his life, decades, along with others, trying to get change in this country for us by using the political system and the votes. That's what's important. Johnson planned. He came to the hearings when they tried to pass get the act through the House. And he brought experts, white and black, who stood up and said that lynching had very little, because the idea was the states wanted to hold on to lynching because they said it's a state right for us to go out and kill. The federal government has no power over that. Can you imagine that? whatever state you're in Illinois, Colorado, that someone said because the state wants to kill blacks, that should be fine. But James Weldon Johnson brought in experts to say lynching had very little to do with that. Lynching was not about states' rights. It wasn't about rape. It wasn't about murder. In fact, many times, people would later say that rape, and that had nothing to do with it. Had nothing to do with it. What it was about, lynching was a system. It was state-supported. And with the police officers, with the governors. It was state-supported terror designed to maintain white supremacy and to keep blacks economically in servitude. That's history. That's what that is. And when you get experts who will actually speak to it, there is a man named I was trying to look for his name, Moorfield Story. Another name. I'm going to type that name out because we need to remember Moorfield Story. Moorfield Story was a board member of the NAACP. And what is important about Moorfield Story is that he was respected, right? He was respected across the aisles as a constitutional expert. So, Moorefield Story, I just typed that real quick. Moorefield Story stood up and told everybody, hey, listen, this is crap. This is not even constitutional. This is not right. He backed the NAACP and he let them know the governors of the states, the police officers, the prosecutors, the grand juries, the sheriffs, all of these instruments of the state are used to keep the Negro down, and in many cases to kill them. So why did we go over all of that? All of that history. One, because I know that majority of us don't know this. Two, because when a statement is made on Erudition that says something about our history, and there's no fact to it, then we need to be able to discuss that. We need to be able to go and look for the history for that. At the heart of it, ladies and gentlemen, I am a researcher by trade and by fashion. And I've spent majority of my life researching and studying and reading. They knew that lynching was a murder, and it was an atrocity. To this day, there is no anti-lynching federal law. The last attempt, after the death of George Floyd, the Republicans did what the Dixiecrats did back then with the Dyer Act. The Dyer Act made its way actually through the House. It actually made its way through the House. And it's it's so crazy because once there was an instant it was going to go to the Senate, the Dixiecrats, and this will sound familiar, loudly threatened to filibuster it to death. Because the only way for a filibuster could be broken is through cloture. And that's a rarity in Congress. And they said we would fight against the idea of millions of people being threatened with illegal murder just to keep that on the books. Johnson fought very hard for this. He went over and over and over again to Harding to try to get him to side with in the early days of Harding's presidency. And Harding wasn't president for very long. And every time he went, Harding gave him these false promises. Eventually, what he did agree to do was agree to investigate the Ku Klux Klan. He wasn't going to denounce it, but he was going, sounds familiar, right? He wasn't going to denounce it, but he would investigate it in private. And though the hundreds and hundreds of chapters that had sprung up and how they dominated in the 20s, he used his attorney general, Harry Doherty, to go in and go to what was then known as the Bureau of Investigation to do an investigation into the Klan, not because of the lynching, but to find out if the Klan had broken any federal laws like finance and whatever, something that we can use on to try to pacify these black folks. And so the House subpoenaed William Simmons, the head of the new Klan. Simmons showed up in full Klan regalia, with a Colonel brand on and phony medals and things on. He showed up and he swore to Congress, hand on the Bible, that the Klan was a moral teaching fraternity, that it was Christian in nature, and they wanted to convert Americans to a Christian righteous path. That's what he said. That's what's documented. And when he finished, he lauded this so much that people in the committee applauded and actually said, "How dare us cause this honorable man to show up here and testify?" Little side note with Simmons, you can go look him up. Simmons was a disgusting individual who later went, raped, bit, mauled, and killed a woman because people refused to go after the Klan, a white woman. And after he thought he had killed her, he dropped her off at her doorstep. And the woman was able to survive long enough to tell her family what he, and to get the authorities and make a statement on what he did to her. Please feel free to go read about William Simmons. And I hate to say that because that's one of my best friend, my late best friend's name. But that man did these atrocities. Ask a question. This goes to show that even when they're looking for classified black people by looking for some other crime other than race, just how much it kills. Truth. That is true. We have power and don't even know it. Yes, many service members were killed and massacred. The idea of empowered black people has always been something that troubles certain parts of America. You know, when we were talking about how when the Dyer Act was being passed, had gotten through the House, and there was a funny thing. I shouldn't say funny, but it is funny because blacks were empowered. And this was what going the line on what my brother just said here and what my son just said. When the Dyer Act went to the Senate, to the House, and it was being passed, blacks showed up. They sat in the galleries of Congress every day and they cheered the politicians, the Republicans who stood up to argue for the anti-lynching, for the lynching law, for the Dyer Act. And every time they got up, Southern Democrats were getting pissed. So eventually they got bold. And I'm going to call it what it is. They got up and told them, this is documented. They jumped up on, someone jumped up on their feet with their fist in the air and shouted, "Sit down, niggas. Sit down, niggas." Now, black folks had been through hell. And a lot of them were feeling pride and self. And they shouted, "We ain't niggas, you're liars." There is a fear here that has always been the fear of a change in power here. Harding refused to disavow the Klan. And because he refused to do that, He gave many reasons. Eventually, they dropped the lynching act out of Republican agendas because they said they needed to keep the country on track financially with shipping deals and different things that were coming up that the president had to have more perspective of. But the president's job and the Congress' job and the government's job is to ensure the rights of those who are citizens. But that didn't matter because, again, what it shows you is you are less than in their opinion and their thoughts. And so, unfortunately, when the bill did not pass and it was taken out, Johnson, NAACP, everybody who had lobbied for it felt betrayed. And they told the Republicans. But you understand that blacks had become Republicans based on Lincoln and based on Grant. They saw the Republicans as the party, right, of liberation. They saw the Republicans as the people who were trying to help them post-slavery. And there was a betrayal there when the president told them, yeah, but that's not our agenda. That's not the major agenda that we need to be looking at right now. As a matter of fact, and I'm trying to look through my notes here, there was a particular thing, and I want to be exact in what Harding did. Harding he went down to Alabama. And when Harding went down to Alabama, this is when Johnson and people at NAACP knew that Harding wasn't serious about being able to back the Dyer Act. Harding went down to Alabama and spoke in front of a crowd of maybe 7,000 people. And again, he made a statement, right? He made a statement. He told people down in Alabama that blacks should be full participants in benefits of society. And at face value, that sounds great, right? Sounds wonderful. However, he also further went and said that fundamental, eternal, and inescapable differences exist between blacks and whites that will always be there. And then he told the blacks who were standing in the background because they were secondary in Alabama, he looked those people who were on the side, out in the sidewalks, while the other whites were standing next to him and listening to the president. He told them, don't you ever aspire to be like a white man. We have to know this history because when we don't, we do what we saw last week. We only pick away at things that we hear about different individuals. He called us inconceivably dangerous. That's what he called blacks. And so when you see the idea in the South of this double talk, right, that allowed lynching to continue, that allowed murders to continue. So when you turn around and you realize that 57 blacks within 1 year of Harding were lynched, that's what we know. That's what we know. It doesn't speak about the horrors that we didn't know about, right? It doesn't talk about those things that history shows you only because something else happened, right? That are the atrocities, the hidden graves, the unmarked graves of hundreds of blacks murdered, right? Even to this day, we see people vanishing in society, and we say to ourselves, oh, that can't be that, right? But the Dyer bill was designed to give some protection against this, for people to be able to kill you simply because they see you as secondary, less than, not human. Harding told Johnson that they were not going to push the Dyer Act, and they had other priorities. At the same time, during that same week of him telling him this, there was a report came from Jasper County, Georgia. And what happened in Jasper County, Georgia is that bodies of 11 blacks had been found in a shallow grave on a farm of John Williams, a well-known white planter, Klansman. And what came out was that the blacks had been held in perpetual slave labor against the law. And when they tried to escape, John Williams went crazy and killed all of them and buried them on his property and bragged about it. And despite witness testimony, despite people knowing it, there was never any charges done or pressed against John Williams. Why the president of the United States told people that it wasn't important. So I make these points this week for that young lady, for those who went along with the idea. There are many, unfortunately, failures that have happened with presidents, both Republican, Democrat, does not matter. And history has shown us only over time how horrible it has been. And what we did not know. And that's only after research, digging, and trying to find out. When Harding died in August of 1923, Calvin Coolidge became president of the United States. And if you know anything about Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal for a reason. They didn't value our lives, and there are many trying to turn back the clock to this very day. Exactly. And they based their attack on it because I remember Bobby D. Gregory said, racism has a long memory. If you feel you're being taught something in your church, in your home, in your social groups, what makes you think that those people ain't being taught that? What great-great-great-granddaddy, what great-great-great-grandma did. Murder based on race still happens in this country. I ain't got to tell you that. You can go on YouTube right now and with every week find some inappropriate thing that has been done. State-sanctioned murder. Harding died in 1923. We are in 2021. Almost 100 years. And yet we're still facing these same horrors and issues and things that people ignore. People have given their lives to fight against this craziness. And yet we're still being taught in our schools. I sat today before I left to go to work. My son is taking a criminal justice course, and I listened to this CBT, computer-based training, and this man say, well, we convict people and give youth, right, young people, harder sentences and the death penalty. We've done that because of the way that the law is, and if the crime is justifiable. Then he went on to say, this is the subtle micro racism. He went on to say, like drug dealers get greater sentences so that the judge can make a statement. Now, they didn't talk about the murderers, the white murderers, killers, who did not get sentenced, got community service, got lesser sentences, had things thrown out the court by the judges. And we live that right now. Because when something is not a law, when something is not put on paper, documented, then it's ambiguous. Then we allow the state, we allow the statutes to tell us what can and cannot happen. And then we have to go back to what Mooresfield's story said. The states, the governors, the legislators, the police, the system is designed to keep people in a perpetual state of terror and to push them to be secondary. That is historical. And when we understand where that came from, the 1920s is important because if you know what our children are taught in books, in their history books, they're taught it was the roaring 20s. It was one of the greatest times in the United States, right? We had all of these wondrous people out here doing great things, and the country was doing great things. It was post-World War I, and America was awesome business and all. No. It all depends on who you were. It all depends on what you were going through. It all depends on what you were looked at in society. Were you secondary? Were you seen as secondary? And when you look at a majority of blacks, people of color, women, during those times, that's what it was. I want to show you something here. This is a book, history book. Look what they, after everything I told you, look at what, let's see if you can see this. Soft-hearted, Harding, and Silent Cal. That's what our kids are taught. And why was Harding soft-hearted? Why did that young lady believe that Harding was such a great president? Because he tried. He tried to work with the blacks. But I just told you what he thought of the blacks. This is what our kids are taught. The roaring 20s, right? When I ask you for erudition to bring your kids, to let them sit here and let's discuss this, I do that for a reason. Because that's what they're being taught. None of this. None of this. None of the things that we've talked to for the last 40 minutes. Not anything about James Weldon Johnson. I heard people when the NFL decided to play the Black National Anthem, why the hell are they playing that song? James Weldon Johnson was a patriot. He believed in the promise of America, and most people don't even know his name. He went up against presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and later on Hoover. Hoover, who acquiesced to the Lily White movement. And if you don't know what the Lily White movement, let me break that down to you really quick too. The Republican Party had blacks, as we just talked about. It was a black and tan movement. And coming out of the post-Civil War into the 20s, all the way up into the 30s, all just before the Depression, and Hoover coming into office, who was seen as the great humanitarian. Go back and look at what they say about Herbert Hoover. But Hoover was a part of the Lily White movement, a movement that was designed to remove black votes out of the Republican Party, to disenfranchise black people in the South and the North from being a part of the political party. A group of people who sat around and said, we will go over and find if blacks have the right pedigree in order to serve in our party. Hoover who during the Great Depression, the beginning of it, turned his back on those who were poor and said, let the churches and everybody figure it out. That's not the federal government's job. When we look at our history and we know our history, then we get to a point where we can't be deceived. We get to a point where we start to look at things a little bit differently, a little bit more closely. And we start to make a decision then. Is this what we want to be? Is this who we want to be? Is this what we want to side with? It makes us question. Every Thursday, I come on, and I know I'm not answering a lot of you all's questions today, but I am a little bit frustrated. History is hard. The things I just went over with you takes research, takes knowledge. It takes knowing where to go. It takes asking questions. It takes hours. It makes you cry. It frustrates you. I've sat here reading some statements from ancestors, from people, white, black, who suffered and went through so we could be better. And when we're offered history, when I give it to you freely and I tell you where to go, it breaks my heart when people say, they regurgitate. And I say, no, don't worry about it. Go here. And then I see you regurgitate it again. Because for everything that has happened, somebody died. Somebody gave their life. I'm not making that up. Somebody went through hell. Somebody caught hell. I'm going to close this week, and I'm going to give you a story that happened when Coolidge came in and NAACP tried to do something different with a new president. And Coolidge told these people, look, since I came in, Silent Cal told them, right, there's been less lynching. There's been less killings. By the time Coolidge was out of office, 96 blacks had been lynched. And there was still no Dyer Act, no anti-lynching law. There's a story that comes out of Aiken, South Carolina. It happened in October 1926. Around this time, there was a lot of bootlegging going on. And so they had different officials who were out here, hired by the government to go seek out bootleggers. Now, a lot of them were corrupt. And black bootleggers who were trying to make it trying to be able to survive, along with the other crooked white bootleggers, were often raised and had their stash stolen from them and then given to whites or taken by the local constabulary, the police, in order to be able to use it for themselves. Well, on this particular time down in Aiken, a horrendous thing happened. Damon Lohman, you will not find this name. You would have to look. Damon Lohman and his sister Bertha Lohman and their cousin Clarence. They were all bootleggers, and they were farmers too. Damon and Bertha's father was the actual bootlegger, but he wasn't home. He was delivering liquor. Well, the Sheriff Henry Howard, showed up with some deputies, a whole thing of deputies, going to the farmhouse to get him. Now, by some reports, they were going there to steal the liquor, right? And they did it because they knew that the father wasn't home. So they showed up, and the elder Lohman wasn't there. So by the reports of the people that were there, they showed up and started shooting, but that's not what the cops said. They said that when the sheriff showed up, the young people started shooting, and they shot and killed the sheriff in their ensuing battle. And Damon and Bertha's mother happened to get shot in the head and killed along with the sheriff. Just happened. But then the Lohmans, They dropped their guns and they gave themselves up. They later said that the deputies had killed the mother, and in the ensuing gunfire had accidentally shot the sheriff. But nobody wanted to believe them because the sheriff, Henry Howard, was a high official of the Ku Klux Klan. So when the Lomans were arrested, they were charged with Howard's murder. Nobody was charged with the murder of the mother. And because Howard was the town sheriff and a top official in the Klan, his body was put in state downtown in the funeral home, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Klansmen from all over showed up in full regalia, marched through the town. They attended his burial service. They burned a cross. They did all of these things, and then the Klansmen praised Howard, even though evidence suggested that he was a crook. So people thought they were going to lynch the Lomans, but the Klansmen thought, no, we're going to let justice be served. They wanted to have a legal killing. And there was a reason behind this, because of the pressure of the NAACP at the time and the idea that a federal law could be passed that could hurt you financially. So they pulled back a little bit, and that was indicative of a certain amount of time in the 20s. That was the power of that dialogue. If you think that act didn't do anything. So they said, let justice be served. We'll let's get it go through the court, because they knew that they owned the court. So sure enough, the Lomans, the sister, the brother, and the cousin were all convicted, and they were sentenced to death. Then they later put the sentence for death down on the sister and said, we'll give her life imprisonment. But the attorney for the Lomans appealed to the Supreme Court of the state, who again had Republicans, people who were afraid of what could happen if we're all found to be doing something illegally. So they decided that they would review the case again. Now, that seems like a great thing for these Black people who may have been falsely accused. But in truth, what happened is that a second trial happened. Another judge was brought in from outside, and the judge found that Damon, the brother, was not guilty. And he also leaned to freeing Bertha and the cousin, because evidence showed that the sheriff and the deputies was crooked. But when that started to happen, the Klan showed up. The Klan came to the courtroom. I want you to think about what's happening in this case happening right now. That's why I bring this up. They showed up in the court in full KKK regalia with guns sitting in the courthouse. They sat solemn. They just stared and glared at the defendants. And when the defendants was put in jail, they thought that they were going to be let go. On the evening of October 8th, it is believed 150 armed men, that's what they say, stormed into jail, cut the electricity off, and ran in and pulled these folks, the Lomans, out of the jail cell at gunpoint. When the sister tried to resist, the men punched her, kicked her, and beat her. Other people in the jail said they could hear her screams of terror all throughout the jail and even outside. They threw him inside of a car, drove him outside of town. And as they got outside of town, the cousin Clarence decided he was going to fight. So they shot him in the chest, threw him outside of the car, strapped him to the back of the bumper, and they dragged him to the field that they were going to go lynch these people in. And they said you could trace where they went to go lynch them because of the blood trail that was left by Clarence's body. I know that's vulgar, but that's the truth. Then they took this brother and this sister out of the car, shot him in the face and in the chest, and lit the sister's dress on fire and burned him. Now, when this was brought up, the sheriff claimed that he was overwhelmed, that they rushed in. Johnson, NAACP, sent people down to investigate. And the NAACP was smart. They sent people who could pass and acted like reporters. The people liked to brag. And they told them the sheriff was involved in it. The new sheriff was involved in it. Come to find out, when it was all said and done, prosecutors, sheriff, people who are related to the governor of the state, all participated in this lynching and this murder. And when Coolidge, this was brought to Coolidge's attention, President Coolidge, silent cow, he refused to charge anybody, even though the evidence was there. I will always speak to history. Yes, it is awful, as it happens. History is truth, but many people want to ignore it because it's hard truth to deal with, on top of many being disenfranchised from actually learning about it in school. But if you do not learn it, you will accept anything. That's true, my son. I say this because, yes, there is some connections to what we see in this Rittenhouse case. When you see people seem to be looking at this and how the legal system, it's also saying an Ahmaud Arbery case, when they say they don't want no black preachers up in there, but the Klan sat in there with their guns. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming down to this hour, and I wanted to keep it at an hour. And I want to admonish you again. Daniel, I see that you came in late. No issue. Always watch the replay. Ladies and gentlemen, share, share, share. Please share. I want to do so much more with Erudition. And there are so many things that we have planned, but I'm one person. I'm doing this as a labor of love every Thursday. And I do it because we need to know this history. If you want to help us, there's a Cash App that goes right across. Anything you could donate would be appreciated. We want to go out and do some trips coming up. I want to go out to Kansas. I'm close to Kansas. And we could do the history of Bleeding Kansas. I want to go touch some history so you can see it firsthand as we do episodes on Erudition. But that takes more sometimes than what I am able to do. And if you can't financially help, can you at least please share? Share. Get others to get into the discussion. Knowledge that just sits here helps no one. This episode, the theme of this episode was because a young lady came on last week and asked a question. And I gave you an hour to answer those questions. Ask questions. Get on Erudition. Engage. Help us to learn together. I see you, nephew. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Yes. Graphic but informative. Everything I say is not going to be pleasant. And everything that I say is not going to make you feel happy about it. But I do it because I want you to know knowledge of self, knowledge of who we are as a country, as a people, black, white, whatever. We all share in this. All right, we're at our hour. I thank you for your time. Please share this episode. Please share the program, subscribe on YouTube, send some money in the Cash App if you want to. Help us to help everyone with this. And until next week, next week is Thanksgiving, so we will do something earlier. I will probably do a pre-recorded program that you can watch as you're with your family on Thanksgiving, just like I usually do on other holidays, Memorial Day or whatever, because I think that even if we're just background noise to spark conversation, we want to do that on Erudition. I don't expect you to sit here and look at my face for an hour, but at least engage in the conversation. If you have a question, please leave it in the comments. I will answer it even after the broadcast. I will put some references in because I covered a lot of information today that will also be here. I didn't get a chance to do that last week, but we will have it in here this week. And we will see what we can do. Probably not because of my schedule, but what I will probably do, like I said, I will send out, it will be a recorded message or a recorded episode you can watch anytime. Also, this helps us to do new shows. If you're looking for new content from the Erudition, help us help you, right? So, all right, I think I beat that horse to death, right? But I thank you all. Have a great and wonderful rest of the week and the rest of this evening. And I thank you again for joining us on Erudition. Until next time, keep us in mind and please share, please share the episodes. Until next time, thank you.